From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, where we sit around and we talk about, modern things, the things that are going on right now, the contemporary things happening in our news and in our city. And today, we're going to start with thinking about those FM stations that have survived the past 40 years, playing classic rock hits and dusties from the 60s and the 70s. Today, we've got the political equivalent of a classic rock hit. It's our Stairway to Heaven. It's July 21st, 1971, and the newly elected Dick Simpson has just joined the city council. He's kind of agitated about the fact that Alderman Tom Keene wants to appoint his son to the Zoning Board of Appeals. It's a pretty obscure appointment, isn't it? But Simpson realizes that the son is a vice president at Arthur Rubloff, the most powerful real estate company in the city at that time. And the alderman, the father, is from the Northwest Side's 31st Ward and the council floor leader. But it's more than just that. I mean, think Ed Burke, but way more influential, maybe like the second most powerful guy in the city, maybe in the state. So this obscure new alderman nobody's really heard of rises and asks, why is it that members of the same families get appointments in several sections of government and only large firms seem to get representation on boards dealing with zoning and construction? Well, Mayor Daley gets a little red-faced. We've seen that before. He jumps up and he says the following to this new alderman who he's just barely met. He says, the idea that I made this appointment because a man's name was Keene and he was the son of a famous member of this council? I made this appointment because I have no... Think of this, picture this in your mind, right? I have known Tommy Keene, the boy I appointed since he's been a baby. Should that boy be told, should he be told he can't hold office because his name is Keene? Where are we going in this country? Referring to the fact that Dick Simpson has just for the last few years been a teacher. He's been a professor over at UIC. It was Circle at that point, Mayor Daley's new campus. Where are we going with these kind of educators? You're doing this to the young people of our country, and Simpson's not the only one. He's typical of a large number of professors in universities polluting the minds of the young people. Frankly, if you're a teacher, God help the students that are in your class. This is what's being taught. And then just a couple days later, Daley had to answer a similar question from Simpson about his own sons getting no-bid insurance work for the city. Daley wasn't amused by that either. And a few days later, there were newspaper reports that Daley had exploded at a closed-door meeting of the City Council Democratic Central Committee. And he was quoted, now here's the Stairway to Heaven. Let's all say this together, shall we? If a man can't put his arms around his son, then what kind of world are we living in? I make no apologies. If I can't help my son, my critics can kiss my ass. Excuse me, children, I know you didn't want to hear that kind of language, but the mayor got excited sometimes. Well, guess what? The good fight. This is what we're talking about today. Dick Simpson's written a book, and Dick Simpson's sitting at the table. Hey, Ken,
you do a great job with that story.
It's so good to have you here. We have so much.
By the way, Mike Royko said about Daley's speech that it was even better in the original German.
Is that where that came from?
Yeah, that's where Mike said.
Oh, see, I've used that line a lot, but I never knew where it came from.
It was from Mike.
Better, yeah. I think I said that about Trump's inaugural speech.
Could well be, yeah.
It was better in the original German. So the thing about your book, and we'll get into this too, is that it's really kind of a series of essays, isn't it? It's a
series of vignettes. It's a series of stories. It's like seeing a slideshow.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might guess, the editor cut down my 60 vignettes to 30, which is normal in a memoir. And they're very different vignettes about personal life, about political life, about religious life, a whole range of things, perhaps wider than the reader might know about me.
I think it's certainly true for me. But anyway, what I was going to say is that it kind of like, it's almost a bit like social media in the sense that you can jump around in it. And that's exactly what I'm going to take the license to do. Instead of starting at the beginning, why don't we start with, it's exactly right where we were. It's like 1970, 71, and you decide that you have had a life already of activism, but you want to become a politician. You want to run for city council. You want to get into the council. Why? What was the thinking there?
So I have to take a step back a couple of years from there. I had originally been I'd been first campaign manager in the 9th Congressional District on the lakefront for Eugene McCarthy's campaign for president. And then I became state campaign manager by the time of the Democratic Convention. Needless to say, we lost, and then we founded the Independent Precinct Organization. Over the years, we won more than 20 elections, electing people like Dawn Clark-Netsch, Bernie Weisberg, Bill Singer, and they had all been outstanding public officials and very good liberals. But the motivation back in those days, of the slogan in the 60s was all power to the people. There was the idea that we should have participatory government and democracy. And so I decided to, when asked by a citizens committee to run, I decided to run for alderman, thinking I could push these more participatory aspects as well as supporting the normal liberal platform of my colleagues like Billy Singer and Dawn Clark-Netsch.
But the reason I wanted to open the way we did is to focus people's minds on the fact that this was not the Chicago of 2015 or 16 or 17. It was a very different Chicago. It was much more difficult for an alderman, I think, to get a voice in that city council of those days.
Yeah, I like to think of Chicago as the epitome of American politics, actually then and now, not meaning that necessarily complimentary, but that, you know, a lot of American politics is very polite. If you're in a place like Bloomington, Indiana, or even Bloomington, Illinois, you know, they wouldn't use the N-word very much. They wouldn't be confrontational about race. You could go to a Democratic Party meeting and no one would be surprised as people showed up and wanted to have a say about the Democratic Party. That's not true in Chicago. And, it, you know, as my colleague Milt Rakoff used to say, we don't want nobody sent, which he got from Bernie Einstein, a famous Chicago Paul. You had to, it was a real clash. We were not fighting in the city council just about a budget amendment, even though we offered 100 every year, me and my other independent colleagues. We were fighting about the future of the city, about democracy, about justice, about equality, about segregation, about equal pay for women. We were fighting over what should Chicago become, and so that's why you know, what would be a normal clash about somebody's appointment was really a clash about patronage and nepotism and the rotten aspects of the Chicago machine. So it was all in that context.
So that was it. So you felt then, I mean, you really actually felt that you would be able to make a difference if you could get a voice, if you could be that guy standing at that microphone. That meant something. That
meant something because, you know, I'd come to Chicago, and so originally I'm not born in Chicago. I didn't grow up here. I was in Africa. Grew up in Texas. Yeah. I was in Africa doing my doctoral dissertation. And all we had as news in those days was Time and Newsweek magazine. It was in provincial towns up country in Sierra Leone. And so I saw this stuff about all the cities going up in flames. These were the riots of 66, 67, 68. There were going to be more riots in 68. And so I wrote my dissertation advisor back in the States, and I said, here's a list of cities, get me a job in one, maybe I can be helpful. I like to joke, as part of the civil rights movement in the South, and the northern agitators had come down and helped us, that maybe I should come help you know, some of the northerners who were having trouble. But in any case, I got back to Indiana University and was writing my dissertation and got an interview up here, and crazy enough, it was after the 67 snow, and the snow on the ground in 67 was higher than this table.
67 snow, yes. Yeah.
And so at that point, what I did was did one interview, went to lunch at the Vernon Park Tap, which is now at the Fanos on Vernon Park, and took the job. I've been there 51 years now. I guess I didn't know better. So anyway, I came to Chicago not knowing anything much about the Daily Machine or anything else. It wasn't out of a political motive except to help with the problems cities were having in the 60s. And I became involved, as I say, in the McCarthy campaign. We came up against the Daley machine. We got only 20% of the vote for our delegate candidates in the North Side. We got 4 delegates out of 114 at the 68 Democratic Convention from Illinois. But we learned from those mistakes and those clashes, and I saw how venal and bad the machine was firsthand, doing the battle in the precincts and then in the trenches.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, we got to do something about this. And that's why I, then created IPO and then went to being an alderman.
The independent precinct organization. So I know that your first run in '71, right?
Right.
You had this kind of three-legged stool. These demands that you said if you were elected, you would represent Lakeview, not the mayor.
Right.
That you would vote the way Lakeview needed to vote, not the way the mayor needed you to vote. That you would begin neighborhood-based government to direct your vote,
Yes.
which I can't imagine. I would think that would have sounded like a Communist Manifesto or something in 1967. Yeah.
Sounded a lot like the SDS Port Huron statement.
Port Huron statement, right? And then I think the other one was.
Well, we was very radical. We were going to open a service office and give everyone their
that's right,
services
the
as a
service
matter
office.
of right.
Yeah, that was
not
the
how
other one
they voted.
That kind of cracked me up. It's like having a service office, and then people would come in and ask you for things, and you would assume that they should get that service as a matter of right because they were a citizen of Chicago.
Not because they'd voted for me or the Democratic Party or whatever.
So
I was pretty naive back then. But that's what our demands were. We were going to change to what would be called participatory democracy. And the closest thing in Chicago now is the participatory budgeting project, which is in 7 wards, but that only controls $1 million per ward. In city services and letting citizens have a voice in that.
Yeah.
We were talking about controlling what was done in the whole city through allowing citizens to somehow shape policy. We really thought citizens should be able to have a voice in the decisions that most affect their lives. And that's, if you think about Trump or you think about Emmanuel today or you think about any of the Ronner as governor, I mean, none of them pay any attention to what the hell citizens want.
So, of course, this is a question better left for toward the end of our conversation, but the question just kind of looms over us here of, did any of this work? Did this progressive agenda resonate with people in a way that it opened up some rivers of opportunity that we're still drinking from today?
It's amazing. The Linda Prey and Bill Singer and Marty Oberman and myself and others who were the independent aldermen, we made changes that can still be seen in Chicago today. I'll give you an example from even one of our predecessors. Paul Douglas was a famous Chicago alderman before he became senator. And he had this very radical idea. And he looked out one winter and the river was frozen. There's nothing on the river. Why do we have bridge tenders in every bridge on the river? Why do we have 114 bridge tenders in the city of Chicago for the 29 bridges?
3 shifts a day.
3 shifts a day, running 24. So there's 2 bridge tenders or 4 per bridge. Throughout 365 days a year. Even if the river's frozen and there's no damn boats going up and down it, you never raise the bridge. But that wasn't.
So he thought that was wrong somehow?
He thought that we could make a savings by a simple method. That if the bridge tender at Michigan Avenue opened the Michigan Avenue Bridge to let a tall ship through, then closed the bridge, that if they went up to Clark Street, he could open the Clark Street Bridge and lower it, and that therefore you needed about 1/3 of the bridge tenders. He proposed that in 1939.
Is that right? 1939?
We finally implemented it fully under Harold Washington in 1980.
Yeah.
So it took nearly 40 years to be able to implement, which was just a cost-saving measure, and also cut the patronage army, of course. The machine never cared what it cost to run government as long as it provided the political army to elect the mayor and the alderman and the other good people like the assessor.
I think just to be fair, we should also say, though, that river traffic in 1939 was much heavier than it was by the time Harold Washington became mayor, right? There were more lifts.
Not many more, because it's still only really the tall sailboats and a couple of others that cause the bridges to open.
Yeah,
anything that's low just goes right under. And we still need bridge tenders, and we actually need bridges that don't fall down and things like that. But so there was no doubt we needed bridge tenders, but do we need them all the time? Do we need them to be like locked in, like they're in concrete at each bridge? And the answer is no. And I give that as an example. We each year made 100 budget proposals. We fought about a number of other things, equality and justice, as I said, and democracy. And yes, each year we would offer things. I'll give you another example of one I managed to achieve. I introduced the legislation for 1% for art, meaning every public building that's built has to put 1% aside so that there would be sculpture or painting or something to beautify the building, and it wouldn't just be ugly. And it would hopefully.
You introduced that.
I introduced that, but it's not got my name on it.
I wonder why.
The head of the committee, Alderman Feifelsky, and Mayor Daley are the official authors of that ordinance, even though I initiated it and we ran a campaign from my office for a year to pass it.
See, that's the problem with you progressives. You're always trying to take credit for
things we do. You know, there's a movement in Hyde Park at the moment to get a public monument to Linda Pray. There is none in the city. We have a small, I started at the Chicago History Fair, a prize for Linda Pray that is the best political history project by high school students, and they get a prize each year. But there's no statue, there's no park, there's no, you know, Lakeshore Drive is not named after Linda Pray. All the great Chicago progressives of the last 150 years, none of us have any monument, whereas I won't name them, but there's certain rogues of the city, many who've even ended up in prison for a while, who have something named after them in memory of their deeds.
There's no hinky-dink kind of park or anything.
No, but that's just an oversight. I'm sure we'll get to it.
So, so you get elected, and you have an 8-year run, and this is, I think, one of the most critical points that you make is that there actually were a number of really important resolutions and a number of things that we just kind of take for granted today that were introduced during these periods. And I told you, I warned you ahead of time. I'm just skipping around.
That's
here.
fine.
But I was really interested to read about the Red Squad and your work on beginning to finally close that chapter of Chicago's really kind of shameful history. 1975, I think it was, right? The ACLU versus City of Chicago. Tell us about that.
So the Red Squad, for your viewers who may not know, started back in the 30s and earlier when they started worrying about the labor movement. And they created a unit in the police department called the Red Squad to keep track of all the commies, that is, labor union organizers and the like. And they continued it on through Richard J. Daley's period as mayor. And they spied on everyone. I mean, when we put together the ACLU versus the City of Chicago, which was actually the lawyers for it were the business and public BPI, business and public
professionals in the
business
public
professionals
interest.
and public interest. That lawsuit, I was joined by people like Adlai Stevenson III, who was still U.S. Senator, who had been spied upon, Linda Pray as alderman, Don Rose as a community activist, IVI, IPO. We had about 20 different community civic organizations and 20 or so major public officials. And what the Red Squad would spy on us, and they would do more than just spy in the sense of sit and take notes. They did that. But they actually were agents provocateurs. They broke up an attempt we did to try and elect officials to county government as independents, we're meeting on the west side in a basement, and one of the Red Squad agents got so provocative that the whole coalition fell apart. We couldn't put together the ticket. So they were interfering with democracy. They were not just nice little guys, and they certainly, I mean, they, you know, it's amazing. They did hundreds of black box jobs. They broke into IBI offices and took all copied all the files, that kind of thing. I mean, these are not nice people. And so we sued them, and we won the case. There were reparations paid to the organizations and the individuals. The individuals, a group of us got together and set up a fund at the Crossroads Fund to then fund other civil liberties efforts for decade to come.
You got like $300K, didn't you? Or was
no, we were on. Yeah, we got up for the total about 25. I think it was 25,000 to all the organizations and.
But that was a lot of money.
That was a lot of money in those days.
Yeah.
But the more important thing is we got an order from the court that they could not do this spying, that this was illegal. For both the FBI who were involved and the Red Squad. I was also spied on by the Army Intelligence Unit. So
really?
There was lots of spying going around in the 60s and 70s. And that was when I was a teacher and not even yet a public official.
Yeah. You know, a little bit of parallelism here that I started at Northeastern up north in 1967, and actually we just had a little 50th anniversary of founding the Northeastern newspaper, the Northeastern Print, just this week, as a matter of fact. And one of the things that we got really involved in is reporting on the fact that the police, I'm sure it was the Red Squad, had agents going to our student union meetings and stuff at our silly little college.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and our attitude at the time was, really? I mean, they think we're dangerous? But sure enough, we had an agent provocateur, and we found that he was going to meetings and, you know, and trying to sort of jack things up a little bit. You know, maybe you need to get
throw
this,
a bomb.
Yeah, we need to be more active, you know.
Right.
So, this was going on everywhere, and it was pretty amazing to see that you were able to actually get this through the legal system and get it acknowledged and ultimately to get it.
Yeah.
We think it was ended.
Well, yeah, we ended it up through when the Twin Towers came down with the terrorist attacks in 2001, and after that the courts ruled that the feds could still spy. And I don't know, I have no reason to think that the Chicago Police Department has reinstituted the Red Squad. That would be terrible if it had, but the feds now have the right to spy because of terrorism.
But you don't really know.
Don't really know one way or the other what's happening.
Yeah, and then again, moving around here, probably one of the things I'm most excited to talk to you about is Shakman and what happened there. Now, this was there were 13 years that you were an expert witness against patronage in Chicago. I don't know why you don't like patronage, but you.
Well, because it's the backbone of the machine and destroys democracy. But otherwise, it's pretty good.
I got to just tell you a little quick story. There's Ben Joravsky and Mick Dumke do a show up at the Hideout called First Tuesdays. I think you may have been on it. One of the most wonderful shows they ever did was with Dick Mell, who came in to deliver his full-throated endorsement of patronage for all the young kids who were there, all these millennials who just didn't understand how the world works. And he said that he was very proud of the fact that he put, I forget, it was 3 or 4 of his kids through college by having them be bridge tenders. And he was so powerful that he got them the night shift when there were no boats. All they just sat there and did their homework all night long and got paid really well. Yeah. So, I mean, you got to say there are advantages to patronage if you're on the right side.
If you're the patronee or whatever.
If you're the patronee. So tell me more about this. The most consequential, it was described as being the most consequential change in Chicago politics and government.
Yes, because Michael Shakman ran in 1970, 69, 70, but 70 essentially. for Constitutional Convention delegate when we rewrote the state constitution.
I never knew that. Also, he
ran.
Did he get it?
Not quite.
Okay. All right.
And then he sued in federal court, saying that the reason he didn't get it was the patronage workers were working against him, and that this took away both rights of candidates and such and citizens, but critical to this case, it also took away the rights of the patronage worker. If you were a patronage worker, you had to work for your sponsor or the party. Yeah. And it took a long time for this to go. I mean, we're talking 1970 when all this started. By the middle 70s, it had worked its way through the first stage, and there was the first Shakman decree said you couldn't, I have to get it right, you couldn't fire workers for not working in a campaign. And the second Shakman decree said you couldn't hire people because they had worked
because they had worked.
And they're exempt offices where
you couldn't hire them, or
you could not.
So if someone had worked on your campaign, they could not be hired.
You can hire them in what are called exempt positions. Right. Like if I want you to be, like if I wanted you to replace Mr. Tillerson at the State Department and I was Mr. Trump, I can hire you for that, and it doesn't matter what our relationship is.
Thanks.
There are about 700, I think there are now 900 positions in the city government which are exempt because they're like your personal secretary, they're getting in confidential information, or there's someone carrying out your policy, like a head of department.
Full disclosure, I had one of those jobs for a couple of years.
Okay, so you can't be a parking maid or a garbage collector or a clerk with, just because you work a campaign. So it's like the Hatch Act nationally. It sort of makes a civil service out of the government. And so the Shakman cases finally worked their way through, and when it was threatened that the Shakman in discovery could get a hold of all of the party documents, including the financing, the party settled. And so slowly they each signed consent decree. The first consent decree, the full consent decree, the last one, the powerful one, was signed by Harold Washington. I was on his transition team. We had argued that he should, and he did in 1983. But
patronage is dead, dead, dead.
Yeah, it was a little premature for it to be dead, but it has gone down because when the first Shakman court case said that the judge said there was more than 20,000 patronage jobs, and Linda Prey and other witnesses said 35,000, but let's call it somewhere 30,000 patronage jobs in the city of Chicago. By the time we get to the Sorich case in the Richard M. Daley administration, and we have the clout list, it turns out that there are about 5,000 patronage jobs for some complicated reasons, but mostly because of the Shakman decree. And that meant that every time someone sued, they had been fired. For instance, Jane Byrne fired all the Daley people. Then later, other people fired other people, or they didn't get hired because of a clear case of patronage. They would go to court individually, and often I would get called as an expert witness. Well, what's patronage? Why is it bad? And so forth. It didn't appear all the time, but pretty consistently over a decade or two.
So, are we? And I'm not being sarcastic when I ask this question. Are we better off under Shakman than we were under patronage? And if so, why and how?
So it takes a little longer to explain. So the Richard J. Daley machine had patronage, nepotism, inevitably corruption, and favoritism. You got we were talking earlier, you got your tree trimmed extra that's not in the parkway because you're a nice guy and voted in the Democratic election. The precinct captain says do it, or the precinct captain fixes your traffic ticket or whatever. So all of those things together make the old Chicago machine. Shakman has forced what I like to use a fancy word, transmogrification of the machine under Richard M. Daley. Of course, we had Harold Washington in the progressive regime, and it rolled back a lot of things that were the old machine and the old form of government. Affirmative action is now happening in city government and so on. But the Richard M. Daley machine still kept some patronage workers. They called themselves the Daley Volunteers. They weren't volunteers, but they were no longer just the ward committeeman, sent in Joe Schmo and he got a job. It was now Daley's own patronage armies under the Hispanic Democratic Organization and others. But he added the rich people from the global economy funded his campaign up to $7 million. And
different kind of patronage.
different kind of, what you usually call pinstripe. But it's different from even the pinstripe. The pinstripe is normally where you represent the widget corporation and I give you a direct contract. Most of the really global firms don't sell widgets to City Hall or paper clips or something. What they want is a beautiful Millennium Park, got a good symphony, nice cultural amenities, so when they bring in the German company to do arbitrage at their offices, they can show them, wine them and dine them and show them a wonderful time and they'll be all happy. And things like that. They want good facility for the Boeing executives so that they will be pleased that they chose Chicago as their corporate headquarters. Those are the things they want. They don't want a direct quid pro quo.
They don't need a job in streets and sand.
No, and so this changes the nature of the machine. So the one thing Shakman has absolutely done is change the machine, and yes, the 21st century machine in Chicago is better than the 20th century machine under Daley. It's not still democracy, which is what I want, but it's made a huge leap forward. It's one thing, another interesting person I just touch on in the book is Jane Byrne. She helped destroy the machine, but that wasn't her intent.
It wasn't what she was. Not
she
what
wanted to run the
she
machine,
right.
but she didn't manage it.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting. We've certainly changed in the 50 years I've watched Chicago politics.
We talk a lot here about Harold Washington
Right.
because he looms large in the history of Chicago. And my guess is that 100 years from now, he still will loom as large as perhaps the Daleys.
What we're trying to do is to elect some new Harold Washingtons
Well, yeah,
to make
there's
another
that.
story.
Yeah. But there are so many different aspects to his legacy. One that I've always found most fascinating is this idea, which is really a kind of an outgrowth of your community democracy thing, of democratizing, I guess, the amount of money that aldermen get for their whatever you call it, their aldermanic prerogatives. It's not that much money, but they
But
get.
there's something even more important that Harold did. When under the Daleys and people like that, when there was big federal money coming to model cities, to revenue sharing, to various other grants, they would, urban renewal, what they would do is they would hire a bunch of patronage hacks, to give out welfare money or to run whatever program, whatever it was supposed to do, literacy, housing, economic development, whatever. Joe Schmo, the patronage worker, would do it. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars going to patronage army and in federal money coming to the city. Harold reversed that. He took the money, he said, okay, the people who are actually doing something about homeless are the churches and the community organizations. The people who are doing something about community economic development are the community economic development corporations, the 501c3s in the neighborhoods. And he switched that money, particularly in the community development block grant money, which was a huge fight in the city council. He switched it to the neighborhoods. That was in addition to, making services more available at the neighborhood level and just like pothole repair and where it's going to happen. He actually switched hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money for, instead of building the patronage army, went to actually helping the community organizations in the developments of the communities. It was one of his biggest and not very well understood changes.
Not fully appreciated. But you also play a very important sort of behind the scenes role in the ultimate success of the Harold Washington administration, because obviously, as we know, we had council wars for the first 3 years of his administration. And then suddenly that stopped because the city council got redistricted and more African-American aldermen were brought in and blah, blah, blah. But that was a massive legal fight, and you played a part in that too.
Yeah, I was an expert witness in all of the gerrymandering cases, which we've gotten very familiar with gerrymandering now, but all the wards were gerrymandered, and they were gerrymandered to disadvantage the minority groups, to keep the number of black aldermen down, keep the number of Latino aldermen almost nothing.
Right, in those days there were like
there were only four. Well, there was originally just one, and then it grew to four, and finally to 7. But Latinos are now 30% of the city, and deserve more seats in the council than they have even now. But it's much closer to the numbers of the population these days. But in those days particularly, up until the last census in 2010, the challenge didn't work then, but it did every other decade. And I would come in as an expert witness, either, what I was an expert witness on, it seems like silly you'd have to have an expert witness. I would testify that, yes, there is a difference in the voting pattern of black aldermen and Latino aldermen and white aldermen, particularly on race issues. And here are the votes, and see, there's a difference. You put all the black aldermen, they voted this way, the whites voted this way. You know, it seems like you wouldn't have to have an expert witness. And I was challenged, and the discovery process was days of testimony. They disrupted my research. They went as far as going to the professional journals where I publish work on the city council studies, and trying to get the peer reviews of my fellow faculty who might have had questions about parts of my studies. They tried to get the editor of the journal to release the information.
And this was the city's lawyers, right?
This was the city's lawyer, the law department. I mean, you know, I quote in the book the old Dooley quote, politics ain't beanbag in Chicago. This is war.
Right, that's right. Yeah. Well, I always liked the Dewey, excuse me, the John Dewey quote that you quote when you're talking about teaching civics, that democracy needs to be born anew every generation, and education as its midwife.
Yes.
And I find that among the many aspects of this that I find so interesting is the fact that through all of this, you remained a professor. You never stopped teaching at UIC. You're almost 51 years now.
Yes, it's been that long. In fact, we're still doing things. Yesterday, we launched a virtual march to the polls. We have early voting. We fought for years to get early voting at UIC. You would think it would have been automatic, you know, why shouldn't we have the kids vote and so forth, but it wasn't. But anyway, we got early voting back in 2016, and we got to have it this year. And we have a project, part of my teaching is to get people involved in civic engagement. So I'm giving members of my class extra credit points if they go vote, either early or later, but particularly early. And they take a selfie in front of the polling place showing that they voted, and they get 5 points if they do that. And if they bring a friend to vote that's not a member of the class because they're competing for these points, they get an extra 5 points. And so we have all sorts of, on the Facebook page of photos of the students who have voted early. We hope to vote close to 1,000. We voted in 2016. 1,000 students early voting. We also have added, by different registration techniques, an effort that has now yielded thousands of new student voters, more than ever before. We increased the voting at UIC. In 2012, 42% of our students voted. In 2016, 55% of our students vote. We had the largest increase of any university in the country of registrations and additional voting in 2016.
Will you be able to repeat that in 18?
Well, it's going to be harder in an off-year election. It'll be down, but in the primary in 2014, we only had 9% of the students vote, and we only had 19% vote in the November election. We're going to break those records by a lot.
Wow.
So, yes, I'm still a teacher, and I still do these weird things like, try and engage students in more than just dull lectures.
Has it ever occurred to you that when the final reckoning is done and the final Wikipedia entry is written on you, that your legacy will be more as a teacher than as a politician?
I have different dimensions of my life. I think of them as religion, love, politics, and teaching. But all of them are really subsumed among teaching. When I fought, as you opened the program, about Tom Keene Jr.'s appointment to the Zoning Board of Appeals, that was what people call a teachable moment. I was teaching Chicago about what is nepotism and why might it be a bad thing if Arthur Rubloff controls your zoning.
Well, let's see. Why would that be?
So all of my life's a teaching.
Let's look at development downtown in the 60s.
Yeah.
And let's look at some of the buildings that were built and who built them and how they got that zoning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the biggest fun thing is most people don't know is the Sears Tower is built over what used to be an alley that Tom Keene Sr. managed to get as his law fee for condemning the street and allowing the Sears Tower to be built. And that's one of the reasons he went to jail for as long as he did.
Is that right?
Yeah. Sears Tower wouldn't exist if it, I mean, Sears Tower is a good thing on the whole, but and they could have done it legally. I mean, they wouldn't have to bribe the head of the city council.
Right. There's so much. There's just so much. You mentioned that that there are these other aspects to your life. I was really relieved when I watched you on with Carol Marine the other day to find that Carol Marine did not know that you were an ordained minister, because I thought, well, if she didn't know, then I have nothing to worry about. But I did not know. There's a lot about you I didn't know that I learned in the good fight. At some point, you just decided that there was this calling, and you became an ordained minister, and you were a minister for many years at Wellington Avenue.
Yes, not the pastor that people usually think of. What they did was commission me as a minister of urban mission.
I like that title.
Yeah, and so what I did was found a bunch of, or not found in all cases, but became executive director of various ecumenical organizations, cross faiths as well. We founded the Urban Institute on Industrial and Urban Society, which allowed us to study and to help congregations do things like open shelters for the homeless, be nuclear weapons free zones, provide food for the hungry, learn how to become sanctuary for refugees, undocumented folks who were coming up from El Salvador and Guatemala in those days, all kinds of justice projects that we could help congregations do successfully and have a real impact on the world. And then I became executive director of Clergy and Laity Concerned, and we were part of this boycott of apartheid in South Africa, and again, nuclear weapons free zones and all kinds of things. We got the county to become a nuclear weapons free zone. Now, we didn't end up getting all the nuclear weapons gone from the world, but we did add pressure towards decreasing them.
It's worth the fight, right?
Yeah.
It's worth attempting it anyway, yeah. You know, one of the really remarkable things about your book is that you really take into this other dimension your personal life and your marriages. There were 3 of them. And I just got to tell you, I found it really fascinating to read, and it's something that we don't know about our public officials. And I'm curious to ask what it was that made you feel that you needed to share this aspect of your life. What was there a moment that made you think I need to be more public about this?
There were a couple of things. First of all, I don't think a memoir can be written unless you write the truth. Or, you know, sometimes you can shield some other people and maybe not tell the whole story that affects their life, but for your own life, you have to, I think, be truth. If it isn't, people will instantly recognize it's just all fluff. The second thing is, I think the struggle between personal and outer life, interior and external, is a struggle that's not just a politician's struggle. I think a lot of people have it, that whatever their job, whatever that work they do.
All sorts of professionals, certainly. Yeah.
And so, you know, the book is called Life, subtitle is Life Lessons. And I think one of the purposes is not just to tell the vignette, but what was learned from the vignette, what was learned from the experience. And because other people are going on with the fight. The other thing that's unusual, I think, in the book, beyond the fact that it's so personal, is that it's really not just my story, it's the story of my generation, the generation that came of age of the 60s politically.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of vignettes of individual people that are heroes doing great things. The Linda Prays and the the Don Clark Netches, but a lot of people may not remember Pierre de Visé and other activists, academics.
I like the fact that you gave a shout out to Ray Nordstrand.
Yes.
And here's the guy who ran WFMT, but was also a really kind of an unacknowledged activist in Chicago.
Yeah, see, most of the business people wouldn't support the independent movement because they were afraid of the daily machine and the consequences. Ray was willing to, of course, he was important not only for the classical music on FMT, but for doing the Midnight Special, and he made the careers of most folk musicians anybody knows about in Chicago, and they all recognize that and all agree. But Ray was willing to put together fundraising benefits with those folk singers and other cultural artists. And when it wasn't a fundraising benefit for my campaign or the aldermanic office, we did ward fairs of all the diversity of Lakeview, and Ray would provide the entertainment. He had the contacts with everyone from Steve Goodman on down. I found there weren't many people like that that were heads of corporations or CEOs and then even in the entertainment, I mean, they'd be happy to do an interview or something because they could get ratings, but they wouldn't be happy to stick their neck out and say, yeah, I think Simpson's right on this.
Yeah. I spent the 80s managing WBEZ in its incipient years, and Ray Nordstrand was very helpful to us, and I was always kind of amazed by that
He was so generous.
Well, here was a station that was nobody, it was threatening nobody in those days, but had the potential to eat into a lot of their audience, but he never saw us as being a threat and was really generous and helpful, and I always appreciated that.
Yeah, and the other, he lived in the 44th Ward, but so did Studs Terkel, and Studs and Ida, his wife, and I became close over the years. Usually we'd go to the peace rallies, and Ida would be getting people to get at the peace rally, and Studs and I would be up on the stage speaking.
Yeah, I don't want to leave this thing though about the personal life, because I think it's so interesting and so vital that we talk about that, because and you're so right about it being this new age dawning in the 60s and 70s with finally women being able to have their own voices and what we now think of as feminism, the early days of that. And it was for the first, well, I shouldn't say for the first time, but popularly available to men of our age to be able to be with women who had their own professional lives and their own interior lives. And it causes conflicts when you don't have that sort of old-fashioned traditional idea that the guy goes out and has this big public life and the little lady stays at home. So we had to deal with the idea that there were going to be conflicts.
There were going to be conflicts, and in addition, there came times when the two partners would grow in different ways. I mean, you'd start out down the same path. My first wife, Scott Simpson, was part of founding IPO. She was the first office manager when I was executive director.
You traveled to Africa with you?
We traveled to Africa.
Not just, I shouldn't say traveled,
I was there for a year doing research, and she was writing a play. And we were good companions. We're still good friends. She was at my first book talk for the book. And I got her permission to tell the story the way I do in the book. But we grew apart, and I wasn't sensitive enough. I mean, there were problems that on both sides in a breakup, but part of it was the pressure of the exterior life and the not yet being developed. And it was the hardest experience of my life, and the breakup, and caused me to think about suicide the only time I did in my life.
I was pretty dramatic to read that,
but it caused me to grow as well. I became a different person because of the experience.
And so many of us of our age have had to deal with lengthy illnesses with our parents because they were a sicker generation. But you had it not once but twice with partners who had extended illnesses that you lived with them through, and it makes me feel very sympathetic for you.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what it's like to be the spouse of a cancer victim or any of the other diseases that are like that. It is very, very difficult. On the other hand, there's a kind of monotony to it. You pull up to the ER, you get out get the wheelchair, you take your wife in, you go park, you come up, find your way through the corridor. You get back, she said she's a cancer patient, she's finally been moved to the back, but you have all this waiting and waiting. It takes 8 hours to get from the time you leave the house until you end up in the hospital for good. And every cancer patient who goes to the hospital, if it were a hangnail, they would end up in the hospital probably because there are too many dangers. It's just, it's an agonizing experience, and it's very hard, of course, when someone's in so much pain and there's nothing you can do about it. Even if they do have pain medications in the room, you can give them the right medication, you can eventually do hospice, but it's a very difficult experience.
Clock is kicking at us here. I want to cover a couple of other things. You were a big part of UIC's effort to snag the the Barack Obama Presidential Library.
We had the best proposal. Unfortunately, we weren't U of C.
I got to tell you, I thought it had some real benefits to it too, like reopening parts of the blue line on the Eisenhower and making the blue line a kind of a spine through it.
And it would have opened up the west side in some very helpful ways.
Yeah. Obviously, you weren't chosen, but I can't help but ask you. Are you a little bit surprised at how contentious this whole thing has become in Jackson Park?
I have been. It's partly because of, I think particularly closing the roads is, really makes it clear to people that it's not going to be a completely simple thing for the neighborhood to adjust to this. I still think the Harold Washington Library is a good idea, and we had
Barack Obama.
The Barack Obama. Yeah, you got me going now. The Barack Obama, the Obama Presidential Library is really a good idea because there are two levels. One is it can make available materials around the world. This is an electronic library as well as a place that you go to visit. You don't have to, I usually use the example when we were doing our proposal, you don't have to build like you do in every other presidential library an Oval Office. You can build the Oval Office as a virtual reality, and you can actually see why the decision to kill Osama bin Laden and be in the Situation Room. You can do things now that you couldn't do when the other libraries were built. So this will be the first modern library of a president, and it is built towards civic engagement and leadership training for people around the world. It comes out of the community organizing mentality, and the possibilities are great. In fact, we expect UIC to be somewhat involved in that end, not the physical, what does the design look like.
But I just can't help but believe that if this was going on in 1973 or something, that you would be out there with picket signs talking about need for a community benefits agreement, and you'd probably be hammering Obama.
Yeah, although what I think will happen, I think it's an excellent talking point to talk about a community benefit agreement. I think it's already had an effect. I mean, when they hired who was going to be the coordinator for the total project and how much minority hiring would have to happen and so forth, I think the benefit of the community benefit agreement is to spell out what does the community really want. We want jobs, we want access, this, that, and the other. Leave aside the roads and the golf course and those arguments, which will obviously take place. I think they'll get most of what they demand, though they may not get the community benefit agreement. But yeah, if I were organizing, I would certainly use the community benefit agreement, but I wouldn't necessarily expect to get the sheet of paper. I would expect to get the jobs.
Get the jobs, yeah. One of the things that you point out in The Good Fight, Dick Simpson, is that you learned the hard way from your early days that there was too much community organizing, and I followed you a little bit because I spent a lot of time working for McGovern in '72. You don't change the country by changing just the president, by changing the top. You have to be willing to work at the library board level, the aldermanic level, and all that. This was a lesson that you learned very early on.
Right, that you couldn't start with the president and work your way down.
Right. Have we learned that lesson?
Well, no, we certainly didn't start with the president. So, actually, I think the Trump resistance will be a great mobilizing mechanism, but the Trump resistance is not really just all the craziness that goes on in Washington. The Trump resistance is, what do we build? What do we want?
Yeah.
Because there'll be an opportunity for a great leap forward after Mr. Trump exits the scene in a couple of years. Can we elect this time not only the president, but could we elect a Congress, and could we have a say in policies? Could we actually design stuff that we really wanted to live in? I can't imagine, why we don't want participatory democracy at the local level to affect policy making. Why do we just vote every 4 years for an alderman who then may not listen to us?
Yeah. We literally are down to 2 minutes here, and I don't even remember what it was that I wanted to ask you. Isn't that weird? There was a last minute thing I wanted to get, and I'm panicking because we're running out of time. So I guess we're just going to have to leave it there. Any final words of wisdom on the coming election?
I think it's important, as always, to vote. I think it's important. I'll just give an example. In Illinois, some of the most important elections will be changing 2 congressional seats from Republican to Democratic, and we haven't, in most of the coverage, we talked about the governor, and I agree, it's important who gets elected governor and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of races that may not even be in your own personal district where lending a hand and making sure that the outcome is what you want is really important, because the country's going to turn on a few elections that are not just obvious.
Do you believe that there's going to be a Democratic swing in 18?
I don't know whether it's going to swing enough to take either house, either the House or the Senate. I know the Democrats will make massive gains. It may take till 2020 before there's enough gain. I'm hoping that at least one house is gained. What we did in the Illinois Coalition Against Reagan Economics was to force the Congress to block the worst cuts. Reagan was going to cut $440 million from local governments in Chicago. We were able to defeat that because we were able to force the congressman to say no. And so I think it's very important that we build on that kind of a strategy in the Trump era.
Give me 15 seconds on the student activists against guns.
It's a great new movement. It's allowing students to speak out. If they speak out now, they'll do that the rest of their lives. If they don't win an early victory, that may or may not be as important as the fact that they learn how to fight.
Perfect. Dick Simpson, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you. That's it. You're watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. Thank you very much for watching. It's a production of CAN TV. We'll be back next week with another program. We'll be talking about the election next week. And don't forget, you can see all of our shows right here by going to this address. And don't forget to listen to our podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud. Okay? Thanks. See you next week. Bye.